If you enjoy listening to inspirational stories from people just like us, facing the fear and doing it anyway, then you're in the right place. My name is Claire Hill, and this is the No Rest for the Vivid podcast. Hello, welcome to another episode of the No Rest for the Vivid podcast. My name is Claire Hill and I'm your host. Today I have the amazing Harriet Shearsmith on the podcast, and this one is a pretty special one. I really enjoyed it. I've known and followed Harriet for about 3 or 4 years, and she actually bought one of my very first wire words. It was when I was mainly on Etsy, and all of a sudden I had all of this action on my Instagram, and I remember exactly where I was, and I was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know it was that Harriet that had ordered. But she's an absolutely wonderful person because of the strength that she's shown in sharing her story, which she goes into a lot of detail on the episode. This episode is very empowering, and I want you to sit with a bit of comfort for yourself. Look after yourself with this, because it may, if you have had similar experiences, you may feel a little raw and you may feel a little upset. I would recommend that if anything comes up for you, definitely write it down and journal about it. If you've never journaled before and you're just listening, just literally free write like you would talk to me. Imagine you're writing, saying, Claire, this is what's happened. But what's really important with episodes of the podcast like this is that we are talking about things that when we were children, would never have been spoken about, because in society's terms, it just wasn't what you spoke about. If we don't talk about things like this, though, it continues the cycle, and we're not here for continuing any cycles. We're here to break them up. We're here to break the path that may have been destined for us, and we're here to build something magical. And I want you to think very carefully that if you have any experiences like this, how they can get in the way of you running your business, moving up in your career, being the parent that you want to be. And just think of it as a step closer to having your own back, because that's what we all need to do. We all need to have our own backs, because some of us haven't been lucky enough to have people behind us. Sorry for that Google notification. Some of us have not had the privilege of having the foundations put instinctively into us to have our own back. And it's important that even if we are in our 30s, 20s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever age you are, start today to be having your own back and learning how to do that. And that starts with awareness. So enjoy the episode. Please let us know what you think about it. I think you can actually comment on Spotify. Go for it. It's all new on Spotify. And we've also got, obviously, you can leave a rate and review. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast. I say please, like in a begging way, but what's really important is that when I put the podcast out, there was obviously so much value in it, and I work really hard on the podcast. And if there is a moment where you've gained some value from it and you've benefited from it in a way that's sort of added a string to your bow in regards to your resilience, healing, moving forward with whatever you want to do, to say thank you. Just subscribe or follow or leave me 5 stars, or just say, nice one, Claire. Because it's very, very important to me that the value is delivered in this podcast. And I just want you to know that I'm really grateful for you for listening. And I know you do, because I see the analytics. I'm trying to say is thank you very much. If I've helped, give me a follow, because it just gets me out. It just gets the podcast out there more, and that can help more people. And that's what we're all about, lifting everybody up. All right. Let me know what you think. Enjoy. Hello, Harriet. Welcome to the No Rest for the Vivid podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being on. I've already done my fangirl thing, and I know that some of the listeners, I'm like, I just love the work that you're doing. And you bought one of my, and I actually remember when you shared that you bought my Vivid Wire, I hadn't had anybody share with any kind of following before. And I was like, what's going on? I didn't know what was happening. So yeah, you bought a Vivid Wire word, I think about 3 years ago. So quite a while ago.
Yeah,
But
I did. Still in my office. I can see it from here.
I love it. I do want to remake it for you. I'm much better at it now, but it's like,
It's gorgeous. It's perfect. Honestly, it is.
oh, thanks. But yeah, I could do better. So Harriet, for those of my listeners that don't know who you are, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Harriet Shearsmith. I am a content creator, I'm an author, I'm a podcaster, I am a mum of three, most importantly. I tend to focus my content creation around parenting and lifestyle and basically our lives and what we do, how things work. And then recently I have moved more into talking about childhood trauma, narcissistic parenting experiences, because that was my experience growing up, and breaking the cycle of generational trauma through your parenting. So as my kids have got older and I've become more aware of my own stuff, then I've moved into kind of talking about that responsive parenting for part of it, and then there's a lot of the humor around it, which sounds like a real juxtaposition to say there's humor around it, but there is, I think sometimes laughter can be good therapy, and especially whether it's parenting or whether I'm talking about the trauma side of things, I think that humor is a vein that goes through all of my content. And I started off with a parenting blog, which I still have, which is Toby and Roo. Mostly I do that or like meal planning on that and that kind of thing
Oh,
now,
nice.
which keeps me going.
Yeah.
It keeps me going. It's more for me than anyone else, to be honest. And then I also have my YouTubes, TikToks, and Instagrams. So I'm all over the place. And my book, Mumming It, came out in 2020.
Oh, wow.
Maybe, or 21. There we go. So
Yeah.
that came out in 2021. That's Mumming It. And yeah, all mum hacks, things to make your parenting a bit easier. I loved the process of writing that. I'd love to write more books. I really enjoyed that.
Amazing. And I mean, the value of your content is there's a lot there. And we're going to talk a little bit about, the childhood trauma part, because, that's my game. Like, and I was saying about the humor, I use a lot of humor, and I think it's really important because it's like a shoehorn to get into people's awareness and understanding. And though it's obviously painful, it doesn't take the pain away, but you might as well laugh at the same time if you can.
Yeah, exactly. I always joke and say, well, at least I can be grateful to my parents for making me funny.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think there's nothing wrong with dark humor, and there's nothing wrong with surrounding yourself with humor almost as a bit of a shield. I think it's a really positive way to be able to work through your own stuff, is sometimes to poke a bit of fun at it as well, and to not take it too seriously. I think we can become really bogged down with that. Obviously it is very serious, but we can address it in a light-hearted way.
Yeah. Definitely. So how did you even start the blog? What's the journey? What's the love story of Toby and Ray?
So I started off when my eldest was a couple of years old and my middle child was 1. And I'd been following a blog called Baby Chino Kids, which, they were amazing back in the day. They were fairly big on social media. I think they're still knocking about, but they kind of went off and did their own thing. And I'd noticed that they were doing so much with their children, but also managing to monetize what they were doing and managing to work around their kids, as opposed to having to find any kind of compromise there. It was all surrounding their parenting, and I really wanted that. And I was working at Mothercare as a retail assistant at the time, and I set the blog first, started off with blogging 3 or 4 times a week, really enjoyed the process of writing, enjoyed the process of gently building the socials. And then my Instagram, I started to take really seriously after about a year and a half of blogging, and it just grew from there. It was back when Instagram was really growable, way before Reels, and it was such a fun time. And I loved that slowly but surely I managed to create something that allows me to be my own boss, allows me to dictate my time around my kids, which is what I really wanted. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that and to have the time with them before they went to school where I could focus on them and I could share the things that we were doing and work with brands as well. So it was always very intentional for me, and I've never made any secret about that. It was very intentional to create it into a career. And then I think it far exceeded anything that I ever expected it to. Initially, I thought, okay, if I can kind of match what I'm doing at Mothercare, then I will be able to quit that and I'll be absolutely fine and that'll be perfect. That's all I want. And then it just skyrocketed into a really lucrative career that has seen me do so much more than I think I ever really realized I would, and has given me so many more opportunities, and more importantly to me, my children, so many opportunities and so many things that I would not have been able to do for them otherwise. So it sounds so cliche to say it's been a wild ride, but it does feel like it's been a bit of a wild ride. I didn't think 5, 6, 10 years ago that I would be running all these big socials and having written a book and doing all of the things that I have. So it's been great.
What's your favourite moment been so far of doing that kind of thing?
I think that's a really difficult one because there've been so many that I've loved. I absolutely loved the process of writing the book.
Yeah.
And I love the community that I've created. I think one of the things that I hadn't really realized when I started blogging, and especially when I started to create my social platforms, was the value that can be found in community online. I think I just kind of thought, okay, I might reach other like-minded mums, specifically at the time. Now, obviously, it's a wider thing. But at the time, I think I just thought, I might reach some other like-minded mums and we can share like crafts we're doing with our kids and that kind of thing. It'll be great. And I hadn't realised actually quite how valuable that community would be in creating this support network, especially since I've set up the podcast of Unfollowing Mum and the social around that and started to talk more about negative experiences with parents, estrangement, and then generational trauma as a parent myself. I don't think I'd ever seen the value in that. One of my favourite things that I've been able to do with my kids was working with Disneyland in Paris.
I was just thinking, I remember when you went to Disneyland, that was really cool because you surprised them, didn't they? They didn't know that they were going, did they? Yeah.
Yeah. So the time that we surprised them and that we did like a really big, I think for about a week before we went, every day we had a countdown and they were holding different cards. It was super easy to do at the time because none of them could read. They were all tiny. My eldest could sort of read bits, but bless his heart, if you say to him, just hold this and don't read it, 90% of the time, even at 12, he'd be like, whatever. So it was really easy to do. Whereas my daughter or my middle son would be like, what does that say? I'm going to read it. I'm going to look at it.
Yeah.
That wasn't a collaboration. That was something that we just did, but I got the opportunity to share that as well, which was really lovely. But we did work with Disney Princess Lego. Take the kids to Disneyland Paris as part of that, and then we worked with Asda and their wonderful range of Disney clothes, because Asda actually has the most phenomenal Disney clothes selection. They really truly do, and we were lucky enough to go to Disneyland with them as well for a photo shoot with them. So we've had some amazing opportunities, and to the kids it's just fun. It's just family life. If somebody asks them what does mum do, they're like, ugh. She sits at home on the computer sometimes, or they'll say things like, oh, she does stuff on her phone.
I just think, I think it was on your stories or something you said about, oh, now they can say I'm a podcaster, not, like, but they forget that I've written a book.
No, they were like, oh, I can tell people that you do podcasting. I'm like, I'm a literal published author, guys, like biggest achievements of my career, but by all means focus on the fact that the mummy's basically an influencer. My son was like, well, I don't tell people that. So
Oh, that's cool. Like, it's like oh, well, it's so funny because my son Jackson, he said to me the other day, like, he knows I'm a wire artist, but he has no idea all the other stuff that I do. He was like, just want to let you know, mummy, you're the best wire artist ever. And I was like, oh, thanks, babe. And it's like, just, he's at that age, he's only 4, where he starts having an idea. And like, mummy's going to work at the bottom of the garden. Like, I used to be a teacher, he had no, I remember, like, no memory of anything like that. So it's funny how your children perceive what you do for a living and have, and then, like, when they do, they're like, oh, I'm not going to say that. It's sort of like, it's just, you're just mum, aren't you?
you are, yeah. And I love that. I think it's my kids sometimes don't realize quite how fortunate they are. So growing up, I didn't have my dad in the picture, and my mum worked full time as a nurse and then later as a manager in the theatre department of nursing. So she was out the door at like 7 in the morning and sometimes not back till 6 at night. So when the kids are like, could you just nip round with my PE kit, because they've forgotten it, they've got no idea quite how lucky they are with the flexibility that myself and my husband have, and I feel very proud that I've managed to create that around them.
Yeah, you should be. That it is amazing. And I think as well, doing about tooting our own horns, and I know a lot of business owners watch this, and other content creators. It's like we make money with our minds. Like, that is amazing. We're in the same league as Elon Musk. I'm going to say it. Like, we create money with our minds, but there's that self-sabotage and imposter syndrome and all of that gets so loud because you are working. It is just your mind. But just sitting in that moment of like, blooming hell, like, I created all of this. It's freaking amazing.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I find it really difficult, especially when you've not necessarily had the most positive influences growing up, and you've not necessarily been given the idea that being proud of yourself is a good thing. It's almost like pride becomes confused with being smug, or it becomes confused with being full of yourself, and absolutely not. It's something that we should be able to take pride in our achievements and in what we've done. And as you say, we might laugh and say, oh, we're in the same frame as Elon Musk and Bezos and that kind of thing, but they started off with a small idea, as every business owner does. Yeah, every business owner does the same. You start off with a small idea and you run with it, and there's going to be pitfalls along the way. There's going to be different kinds of successes that will look different for you, but allowing yourself to take pride in that is huge, and it's something that I really, really work on. But when I reframe it as proud of something for my kids, that I find easier.
Yeah.
When I try to do it as just proud for me, I'm like,
yeah.
You could have done better. So it's always more difficult. But I find that if I look at things through the lens of my children and what I've managed to do for them, I find that easier.
Oh, that's really good. That, yeah, looking through the lens for your children, that is really, and actually moving on to the work you're doing now, my journey, and as we shared before, there's some bits that I can't talk about at the moment, but a lot of my listeners know I'm quite public with the fact that I grew up, I didn't have a very nice childhood. It was quite traumatic, and having the lens to look through my son's eyes at my worth has helped my sort of recovery and healing so much. And I don't think I would have had those moments without becoming a mum, because, and also having that idea of self-worth of, like, to have worth in a parent's eyes because you're serving them and existing for them when that's not why we are here. But looking and thinking, well, my son Jackson, he was born and he basically just shit and ate and just lay there, but he was still worth something in the world. So why am I any different because I'm not serving in that moment or being, and all of those self-worth. My eyes just was like, I just opened to this whole world of understanding that we're worthy regardless. And it's nobody's decision whether you're worthy or not. You're just worthy, because we birth these kids. They're worthy as soon as they take a breath, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you've had a toxic or a difficult upbringing, becoming a parent has a massive impact on how you view your upbringing, because it starts off with little things. Like I used to say, well, I'm not going to do that with my kids. And then sometimes I would have to sit and think, well, why? what exactly about that experience has red flagged to you. And sometimes I wouldn't know. And when obviously as my children got older and I started to notice more of my mother's behavior impacting them and targeting them, that was when things really started to shift for me. But when it comes to looking at yourself, looking at your own experiences, I think becoming a parent has a huge impact on that and has a huge spin on how you might feel about it. It makes you completely shift your perspective.
Yeah. And so going back to that, having that idea, and obviously this, when you started your journey into the content creation world, that this toxic relationship with your mum was already, when was it that you decided that in relation to content creation, I suppose, when it started to move towards this is not what I want in my life anymore, and then the progression and development into I need to talk about this because people need to hear it. What were the sort of time spins and how you came up and developed those ideas?
So when I first started Toby and Roo, we were living with my mum. And if you'd have asked me at the time, I would have said we had the most wonderful relationship. We were super close. We were best friends. It was my role in life to be her everything, to be her spouse, to be her therapist, to be her best friend, to be everything. And it was my role to always make sure that she was put first, really. And I never would have seen it that way. I just saw it as we were best friends, and that was great. We had the most amazing close relationship. And what I've come to learn now is that actually we had an incredibly enmeshed relationship. And when I had my children, that was when I started to notice things that weren't working for me, that were unacceptable behaviours, and certainly not with Reuben at first. I think there were things that now I look back, I think, okay, now I understand why I reacted the way that I did. Now I understand her motivation behind that. Small example, I'd had a very traumatic birth with my eldest, ended in an emergency C-section. I was fine all the way through pregnancy, had a great pregnancy, and then in birth he just could not come. He had to be born by emergency section. They tried all sorts of different things and it was just a really difficult experience. I came home and I remember my mum sitting across from me. She was very heavily involved in everything. She'd been at the birth, which also red flag. And I think at the time I didn't feel particularly comfortable with it, but felt like I had to have her there. She was also at my second child's birth, and that was so difficult because by that point I'd started to really wake up to the fact that our relationship perhaps was not as close as I thought it was. And I remember the midwife pulling me aside when my husband had gone outside and my mum had gone to the toilet and saying, "Do you want me to make one of them leave? Because you are clearly not okay." And I said to her, "Please don't ask her to leave. If you ask her to leave, it's just going to cause so many problems for me. Please, please don't ask her to leave.
Wow.
I'll sort it. It'll be fine." Mid-contraction, I'll sort it.
Oh my God.
And I said to my mum in the bathroom, "Mum, you're making this so difficult with the way you're behaving." And the midwives asked me if I want to ask you to leave. Please stop it. And she'd said to me, "Well, if you asked me to leave, I would leave, but I would not be coming back and you wouldn't see me again." I was like, "I'm having a contraction." So it was that enmeshed relationship and not wanting to disappoint her, not wanting to step outside of what I thought being a good daughter would be. Fast forward to my daughter being born. We opted to buy the house that we'd been paying for, that was mum's house. We'd been paying for that for a few years, and got to the point where we'd sort of said, if we don't buy this property, we need to go off and buy our own because we need to have something to show for what we're doing. And I think, "I'll build you an annex." So that's what we did. We built mum an annex, which right from the get-go, she was really resentful of. She absolutely hated it. Thought that it was the worst thing ever, even though she sat and designed everything for it. She really resented it. And by the time it was actually built, custom built to her specifications as well, it was referred to as the shed. I've been put out in the shed. It took her a few months to move into it, even after it had been built, to the point where we basically had to say, if you don't go now, it's going to be a real problem, because we've built it for you. It's got everything in there that you need and that you want and that you've asked for, including the extra TVs that you've shouted at me to buy in front of the builders and all of these ridiculous things. You've got everything over there. You're just not leaving our home, and we need our own space now. You know, I'm in my 30s. We've got 3 kids. We're really busy. We need our own space.
Yeah.
And eventually she did go over into the annex, and that lasted for about a year and a half. And I think having the kids and those slow trickles, like I say, at the birth, not wanting to put my mum out, not wanting to upset her. And that I was halfway through a story about my first birth then. She'd sat across me speaking to the health visitor, and I'd said, look, I'm fine, I'm okay. And she insisted and insisted, and this is the first birth of my first child, she'd insisted and insisted that I wasn't fine, that I must be depressed. And at the time, I just thought of it as a caring mum, but actually what she was doing was manipulating the situation to cast doubt on my own ability as to whether or not I could cope, so that I felt reliant on her, which is
so she's the hero.
She's the hero.
Yeah.
So that was, as I became more aware of that, and that was when we probably would have got to second child, where I'd start to call things out, and the relationship just got worse and worse. And it was just a really difficult process that took about 10 years. And I think this is what people don't realize, is when I started having my kids, that was when the realization of how actually this relationship wasn't this best friend, all healthy, all happy relationship. This was really toxic and really difficult and very enmeshed. And it was a long, drawn out process from realizing, probably when we'd started to talk about buying the house and saying we needed our own space, that was because I was finding our relationship incredibly difficult to cope with. And even then, it was still another 3 years, 4 years before I managed to say, okay, Mum, I need you to move out of this annex. This is horrendous. We can't even be in the same room together without you calling me names, shouting at me like I'm a child, ringing me at 11 o'clock at night to find out why we haven't returned yet, and demanding that I call you to let you know how well I am or not. It's just over the top. I'm an adult with my own life. I think we're going to need you to move out of this annex. And we offered to buy her a house and make sure she was all set up. And she said no. So it ensued in a bit of a legal battle. Eventually she did leave the property, and we haven't spoken to each other since, really. I think at the time my whole intention was to create that low contact distance relationship, so that we'd maybe see her on special occasions. I'd perhaps pop in once a week, still trying to be the good daughter. And unfortunately, Mum was just not going to have it that way. It was either I am able to maintain control of you, or I am going to destroy you. And that was her words, were, I am going to hit you where it hurts, and that's financially, and I'm going to make sure that you suffer for this. So
that is, it's like hit you in the face with a chair. Horrible. Like she didn't do herself any favors though by doing that, did she? Sort of like, well, that's exactly why we need you to move out and everything, because you say stuff like that.
And so much of my experience surrounding this, and I've gone through therapy since this happened. I'm in my 3rd year of being estranged from my mum, and really worked on myself and on my healing and on my trauma. And so much of what happened, I still feel immense guilt for. I will still say, I remember ringing my therapist and saying, and this was trying to book in with her, I was like, I think I need some help because I think I might be the narcissist. And she got me to give her some details, and she was like, yeah, okay, you are definitely not the problem here.
No, yeah.
For years beforehand, I'd speak to friends and they'd say, Harriet, you're not the problem. the way your mum treats you is abysmal. And then I'd done some work with a life coach, which actually had started through a collaboration that I'd done. They wanted all of the content creators that were working with them to do either something like life coaching or something along those lines to talk about the experience. And I ended up sticking with her because she was so good. And she'd sat me down one session and said to me, do you know what one of your biggest blocks is? It's your relationship with your mum. And I just want to give you a really big hug because I don't think you're quite there yet. But something has got to give here because you're struggling so much with this relationship. And it's not okay, the things that you tell me. And at the time, that was when we'd started building the annex, I think, and she was it just became such a nasty relationship. And I think the predominant factor in that is she'd realised that she was losing control of me as a person. And that's when her real narcissism started to show.
Because it gets louder when they feel like they're losing the control, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And anybody who knows anything about toxic parents or narcissistic parents will know that when that relationship is challenged or threatened, or when you have a loss of control, when they can see that you are no longer going to offer them that supply, that's when things start to turn from, can we make amends, let's work on I'm sorry, which very rarely would I ever get an apology from my mum, and if I did, it would be, I'm sorry you feel that way.
Yeah.
But that's when the real nastiness starts to begin, when they can see that they are losing control. And that was my experience. But there's so much since that time that I've looked back on and thought, okay, wow, actually looking at it through a different lens, I see what that was now, like the sitting across from the health visitor. And that reduced me to tears at the time. I just sat and cried and kept saying, I'm fine, I honestly am, which made me sound more not fine.
Yeah.
There I was sobbing with a new baby in my arms, going, I'm fine, I really am. And it was all really engineered by my mum and the way that she behaved.
It's removing those, like being through a few situations and a relationship I've actually it's sort of like I began attracting other narcissists but had one, and then suddenly losing those tinted glasses that you look through because you excuse all of the behaviors, you excuse how it makes you feel, you like we were saying about before we were talking about self-gaslighting, the amount of self-gaslighting I've done in my life can't really be that bad because, you know, look how they treat other people, or you know, though when those glasses slip, it's impossible to put them back on. Like you can't ever not see what you then see once those glasses slip. And I think, from my own personal experience, when it's the grief of then realizing what you've not had or what you thought you had, and then you feel so embarrassed because so other people are telling me something that I can't see what's going on here. So am I stupid? Am I this, that, and the other? And again, you self-blame because you haven't been given the resources to be able to protect yourself in that way. And then the next journey of becoming your own inner child parent. And that is just like your brain, it just is mind-blowing. So I just want to say to anyone that's beginning this journey or is at the beginning of understanding all of the impacts of having a narcissist in your life, I just want to say they are never going to change. It is impossible for them to ever change, but you can start that journey. It's worth doing, but it is incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's really difficult. And I think, you know, if you have somebody who has narcissism, who has a narcissistic personality, then no, they're not going to change unless you set incredibly firm boundaries with them. Then you can mitigate their behavior, but it's not them changing, it's them realizing that they're not going to get that from you and finding it from somebody else. And invariably that becomes the end of the relationship. I think people can be toxic and can behave in a toxic manner and change. I do believe that. I think it takes a lot of willingness and a lot of self-work to be able to do that. But if you have somebody who is a narcissist and who values themselves above you, they're not going to change for you. And that's really difficult pill to swallow. I think you have to be in the right mindset to be able to swallow that and say, okay, this is never going to be any different. How can I either manage this in a way that's going to protect me, or how can I walk away from this and start to do so?
And when you on your podcast you've spoken about putting those boundaries, I personally found through my development for myself again, and then I think it's you go through that process of like, oh, can I be a better version of myself? Oh, what's getting in the way? And like you were saying about having that coaching experience, you start those processes. So, you know, I've had coaching, I've had therapy, I've had all of these things but in my own mind, I was never ready to see what I needed to see in order to progress further. And there were massive blocks for me, definitely. But creating those boundaries, I had to see that I was worth, going back to that self-worth, I had to learn and have the confidence that I did have worth, that I was worth protecting and protecting myself. It was worth doing. It was worth having my own back, because nobody had ever had my back ever before. I mean, my husband's like proper hero ofs, and you know, I won't be married to him obviously, and my sister, you know, this is the thing, when different from your family, I've got siblings, and so when you read about it, then the narcissist puts you in different roles. So I'm in this certain role, so my siblings have different experiences, and again, the other relationship that it was with a narcissist, that was very put us in our roles, because that suits them. Let's put you in a box because you need to stay in that box because I need to control you in that way. But it's just learning the boundaries. And as I've grown as a person, and like, no, I am like, my inner child needs protecting. I need to protect myself. Boundaries feel much easier, but it's still scary, because then you still have that part of you that you know, and I'm sure you're still working on it too. I'm still working on that part of me that's going, no, you are worth protecting. You are worth protecting. You do need to protect. And like this phrase that you use, protecting your peace. I freaking love that, because protecting your peace, everybody's peace is subjective. So it's not something that like my story, your story, everybody else's story is not going to be the same for everybody, but you sort of can glimmer little like tiny bits of armor from sharing your story like you do, that can help somebody build up their armor, their self-worth, and be able to put those boundaries into place. But it's understanding you're doing it for you. And that's the bit, isn't it? If you haven't grown up with somebody saying, I value you just because you breathe, I value you, that's fine. If you don't have that, guys, that's where the work is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's getting out of your own way and being able to realize that you are worthy either of the things that you achieve, or you're worthy of putting the effort into yourself, and you're worthy of protecting yourself. It's really difficult to do. And I think as well, for me, my mum would argue that, you know, she was incredibly supportive of me. She always used to tell me I could do anything I put on my mind to. I could do this, I could do that. It was amazing. And that was when I was in that golden child role. You talked about the roles. So when you're a mini child, you tend to fulfill all of the roles that the narcissist needs just at any given time. So you might be their scapegoat at one point. You might then become their golden child when you're compliant. And then you might become the invisible child, which is less common in an only child situation. But you don't have that relationship with a sibling for you to be triangulated against, where they're pitting you against each other. But what I would say to anyone listening who does have siblings and who does have that very different experience is that your experiences don't invalidate one another.
No,
but it's a really difficult thing to acknowledge, because so often when we talk about a toxic childhood or a difficult childhood, there is this perception that, especially if you were raised in the same household, you'll all agree because you all have the same thing. And actually, no,
No.
I know that I am a parent that puts the work in, and I know that I am a parent that does my best. And I also, I'm conscious and aware enough of the fact that I'm a parent whose children will have issues with things I've done and will have their own cycles to break when they're older, because that's life. We break things, we evolve them, we change. There will be things that I do as a parent now that perhaps they'll say, I didn't like that, or that didn't make me feel good, and I'm not conscious of it. But I will look to make that repair when I'm older and say, actually, I validate how you feel, and I'm really sorry that I made you feel that way. I acknowledge that, and I've made a mistake there. Let's talk about it. But it's not about perfection. It's not about being the brilliant parent, but it is about saying, okay, that experience doesn't invalidate me, and my kids will have totally different experiences of me as a parent, purely by virtue of the fact that we're all different people. So my eldest has a very different parent to what my youngest has or had, because I'm a different person now to how I behaved when I first had him. I've learned better, I do better. And I think there's value in acknowledging that and saying, okay, just because your experience of my mum was great doesn't mean that invalidates my experience of her being awful. And that's okay to say that. And it's difficult to accept that sometimes, because then comes the self-gaslighting of, well, perhaps I've made it up. Mum always did say I was overly dramatic, so perhaps I'm wrong there. And then you start doubting yourself, you start questioning yourself and gaslighting yourself, which makes the narcissist's job easier.
Yeah. Just as you're saying it, though, it's just so it's so, even now if I talk about it, I can still feel I'm still raw with it, but I'm not. Do you sort of, like you feel it and you're like, yeah, but I've got all of these techniques now, so it's not like, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, but don't forget, you're still okay, everything's all right, you're safe, and all of that. Do you feel what, like, now looking back, so you're 3 years on, and obviously it was a positive move for you as well as a difficult one. Where do you feel that you've gained the most from it? And that's sort of like a bit of a general question, but what I'm trying to get at is, in your own sort of the way you perceive yourself as just, Harriet, how has that changed and developed, and what have you gained from that experience of protecting yourself in that way?
I think it probably sounds a bit cliche, but I think I've realised that I'm a lot stronger than I thought I was. I had a lot going on around what was happening with my mum, and the whole thing, my whole world just felt like it crumbled, to be honest. It felt like being completely shattered and having to rebuild from there. And it's given me a different perspective to realise that actually I am okay, and I am very strong, and I can do these things, and have a little bit more faith and confidence in myself. And then to become a much more conscious parent, a much more aware parent, because I am aware of my own trauma as a child, but without becoming a parent who is frightened to make mistakes, or becoming a parent who is so desperate to not repeat the cycle that I'm just blindly doing the opposite. Because I think sometimes when we just blindly do the opposite, we end up doing damage anyway, because we're not perhaps parenting, we're trying to be a friend and trying to slip into that role of just being kind all the time, being nice all the time, being their bestie. And actually sometimes I have a 12-year-old, and if he doesn't want to do certain things, then I've got to be the bad guy sometimes. That's part of being a parent, and sometimes he is going to hate me and he is going to think I'm the worst person in the world, and that's okay, because I can hold space for those big emotions and take it on the chin basically and say that's all right. So I feel like one of the biggest changes has been in myself and my confidence, in the way that I value myself more and won't tolerate anything less now. I've seen on social media a few times sayings like, oh, what is it? I burn bridges as necessary because I know I can swim. And I do. I know.
That's brilliant.
So I'm not afraid to burn the bridge if I need to. I'm not afraid to say no. I'm not afraid to say, actually, that's not going to work for me, and be a bit firmer with things. I'm not afraid to set boundaries. I think for so much of my life and in so many of my relationships, I've not set boundaries, or I've been willing to put my blinkers on, because it's all well and good to say, oh, I didn't actually see it, I didn't actually know. But sometimes I think, you're just willing to wear the blinkers because it's easier and it hurts less, or you think it hurts less. And I've really struggled to put myself first and say, I'm not going to tolerate that because I deserve better. And one of the things that has come out of this, I often am like, this post breakdown, is a sense of self-worth and a sense of confidence in myself and not tolerating less. And then, of course, being able to parent more consciously, I think for me is huge, because there's a lot of guilt around how I did parent when I was younger, and the things that I feel I don't like that I did as a parent, that I have discussed with my eldest and sort of said, I apologise for the way that I spoke to you there, or I apologise for this. And he's been like, it's all right. And I think anybody who's gone through that experience, I follow, I think she's called Mama Cusses, or Mummy Cusses, something like that on Instagram. I'd have to look her up. She's brilliant. And she talks a lot about how her eldest, who I think is 16, 17 now, has a very different parent to her 5-6-year-old. Because she's totally different. And even her eldest will acknowledge that and say, God, Mum, if I'd have done that, you'd have whooped me. And she's like, I'm really sorry. And the eldest is just like, it's okay. You had to be that parent to be this parent. And that's okay.
Oh, wow.
Because she's managed to make that repair with her, and she's managed to become that conscious parent that she wanted to be. So I think that has a huge impact on me.
And where do you feel that that's reflected, that sense of strength, feeling stronger and valuing yourself more? Is that reflected in your business and how you run, your career? Obviously it does, because you talk about it now in that way, but like how you show up, do you feel that you show up differently now?
I feel like actually my business is probably the only area where I've always felt quite in control. Now I'm a little bit more bolshy, I think, with the things that I want. I think perhaps I have a bit more of a, I think I've got it sounds ridiculous, but I've maybe got my groove back.
Yeah.
I think when I was unaware of how toxic my relationship with my mum was, I think I was in this phase where I was her golden child at the time. She was all over how wonderful I was. I was pregnant. That was very exciting. And I could achieve anything. That was amazing. And I would get the usual dig of, you're not very good at this, but for the most part, I think I felt like I had a real confidence in myself from a business perspective. And it's when I started to really open up my eyes to how toxic things were that I lost that a little bit. I think I lost some of my shine. And now I feel like I trust in myself better. During the phase where I'd asked my mum to leave and everything in my life had really gone wrong, because obviously when you go through that big change, it affects everything. It affects your children. You're worried about how they are. It certainly affected my marriage. That was a really rocky time for us. And I think it just impacted so much that I lost trust in myself when I was going through the estrangement. And I feel like I've gained a lot of trust in myself. I also think perhaps I'm back to when you're young and you're in your early 20s, before you've got kids and you've got people you are responsible for. You've almost got a more risky attitude. You'll kind of be like, oh, I'll take a risk there. And for so long, I was just afraid that if I took a risk, things were going to get worse. And now I think I'm a bit more like, how much worse are they going to get?
Yeah, because you've been through that now.
What's going to go wrong now? Like, if I can do that, well.
Yeah.
I think I just have a little bit more edge back to me, which is sounds bizarre, knowing how I know how toxic my childhood was, having worked through it in therapy, having spoken to numerous different therapists about my experience. I know how toxic that was. And yet I do feel like towards the end of early teens, late 20s, I was quite bolshy. In fact, I would go so far as to say I had a lot of my mum's more negative qualities that I used to try and protect myself from her behaviour and to mirror her behaviour, to try and be what she wanted me to be. So I had that confidence and I had that bulge. I thought I was untouchable for a while. And then I realized just how damaged I was.
Yeah. And when you began, and obviously that sense of trust in yourself to make the decision to share your story, that must have been I suppose it is a risky decision to make in that way. But I just want to, again, thank you for sharing, because that vulnerability, I think, being so vulnerable, it's and going through my own stages of sharing vulnerability, the amount of people, whenever I did a podcast episode once and it was so vulnerable, it was so raw, and I was thinking, I don't know if I can post this, when you're like, publish, should I just delete? Oh my god, and I just did it, and I just felt really sick, really anxious. And it's one of the most listened to podcast episodes. I've had so many people go, I'm so happy that you said that, like, I'm so glad you shared that. And it was, really, really important that I did that. But when you first do it, you're like, shall I? Oh, I don't know how this is gonna happen. So you must have been like, can you remember those thought processes of when you first started sharing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So when I first started sharing, I think funnily enough, a lot of people had been messaging me saying, I haven't heard you mention your mum for a while. I haven't seen you talk about the annex or anything like that. What's going on? And I'd had to sort of privately say to a few people, well, mum's no longer living with us. And then I'd get more messages saying, oh, if your mum's no longer living with you, what are you going to do with this? And so it kind of evolved from there. And then I'd started to talk about not having a positive relationship with my mum and becoming estranged. And that initial discussion around it was so frightening. So frightening and so overwhelming. And so again, there was all that self-doubt of, am I doing the right thing? Does this make me a bad person? Am I awful? Should I be talking about this? Is this fair? And all this doubt around it, and the response from it is really what kept me going. And I found, again, that community, that sense of community healing to be huge, because I think we're quite self-centered beings, and unless we can see other people going through it, we think we must be the only ones.
Yeah.
And you're never the only one. You never ever are. No matter what you're going through, you are never the only one. Yes, your circumstances will be unique to you, but you are never the only one going through it. And when I started to speak about estrangement, there were just so few people that did talk about it, and so few people who were willing to be open and honest about it and to say this is their experience. Or they would talk about cycle breaking parenting, but only from a parenting point of view. It would never be to criticize their own childhoods. It would just be, I didn't have a good childhood. I'm not going to talk about how or why, but I didn't. And this is how I'm different. And I think just being able to step into that discomfort and say, these were my experiences, seeing so many people relate, was both heartbreaking and really rewarding at the same time, because I know every time I publish a podcast episode, I know I will get hundreds of messages from people saying, God, this has really helped me. And my TikTok in particular, I talk a lot about estrangement on there. And the amount of messages that I get, the amount of comments that I get from people saying this has really helped, especially as we're filming this is coming up to Mother's Day, especially at this time of year, because it's really difficult for people. So those feelings surrounding it, whilst they were full of fear and full of worry and full of anxiety, it's been so rewarding to be able to build this community.
Yeah. And it's about, it's so important, I think. Again, it's going back to those voices in your head going, no one wants to hear your story. Like, you have to battle that. And it's like, well, but what would I have wanted? I would want to know that this is actually what happens and you're not on your own. And it is that feeling. I remember being at school and feeling so alone because no one else, or even more recently, like, I physically don't know anybody with the same kind of childhood, that I've experienced, and relationships and stuff. And the other narcissistic relationship that I've divorced recently, I don't know anybody physically in human form, you know what I mean, in real life, that has gone through that. So when I'm seeking, you feel like this isn't right. That's where that self-gaslighting comes in, because you're like, well, if no one else around me is like that and I've got no one to talk to or relate to, then it must be wrong. So you keep going with these patterns. And it's only now that we have social media, creation of communities, that you can go, oh, I'm not. Oh, and then you can absorb yourself in learning about it. Those pathways of learning about a narcissist have been, for me, though I've got a master's degree in trauma informed education, and that's why I feed it into my business support, because anyone that's experienced trauma, they learn differently. So that's how I deliver all of my training and my coaching and everything. But I had a master's degree. Nobody ever talked about narcissistic parents. Is it like, even though actually when you start talking to people, that's what my mum does, that's what my dad does, and then you realize it's actually out there, but it's not you're not going to find it in a school lesson. You're not going to find it in your group of friends. And if you don't talk about it as a content creator with the audience you have, if I don't talk about it in my membership, if you don't do stuff like that, then nobody's ever going to know, and then they can't start their own paths of healing and recovery.
Absolutely. And I spoke to Abby Williams, who runs You the Mother, on the podcast recently, and she is a therapist, and she'd said community is huge for healing, for working through those things. And especially if you're somebody who's quite analytical, I find reading about it, learning about it, and educating myself on these different things to be a huge part of healing for me. And it's funny because I spoke to my therapist and sort of said to her, oh, well, I'm reading this, and I said, do you think maybe I shouldn't, am I talking myself into it? She was like, no, you are somebody who finds a lot of support for yourself and learns how to manage your own emotions through learning. You can see that in the way that you change. So I think you're developing your own coping mechanisms, and you're challenging your unhealthy ones by learning all of these different things and doing better. And for me, that was huge, was getting educated on these different things. And I think there's this perception now that narcissist is a push word, or that toxic parent or estranged has become a trend. And it's not that at all. It's that we are much more open and honest about it, because 20, 30, 50 years ago, it was not socially acceptable to talk about. It's still not socially acceptable to talk about. We still really struggle with the concept that a parent, especially a mother, because we're okay with accepting the deadbeat dad narrative. Yeah. Especially a mother, accepting the switching narrative from this wholesome, giving, loving, wonderful force in your life, which is great for many, and accepting that actually perhaps not everybody has that. And that might not look like sexual abuse, that might not look like physical abuse, that might look like years upon years of really sneaky and underhand emotional abuse that outwardly people wouldn't even really acknowledge as abuse, but when you look at it altogether is very much abuse. I spoke to a wonderful psychotherapist called Helen Villas on a podcast with her and her co-host, who they host Insight Pod with Katie McKenna. Both of them are psychotherapists, both specialise in narcissism and working with people who have childhood trauma and who are people pleasers and all the rest of it. And Helen in particular specialises in narcissism. And she had said that emotional abuse is the cornerstone of all abuse. No abuse exists without emotional abuse as its cohort. And the fact that we dismiss it is what allows abusers to stay abusing. And until we start to give it the gravitas that it deserves, and until we start to really recognise it as abuse on its own, without needing there to be any other kind of abuse, but to be pure emotional abuse, we will not see more people being able to break free of abuse. Because if we could break free of the emotional abuse side of things, it might not get to the others. But because we dismiss this and we don't see it as a total type of abuse, we just see it as maybe they're a bit mean, or maybe they're a bit negligent, as opposed to actually saying, no, that's what that is. It's abuse. It's an abusive behaviour. Until we start to acknowledge it as that, we're going to see more people stuck in this cycle. And now that we are becoming more open about it, and we are, especially with the power of social media, I think there's a huge power in acknowledging that and in seeing it for what it is.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for that. That's like, you can definitely soundbite all of that, because that is basically why you need to talk about things because, and it's also just a self-awareness, because as soon as you start opening your eyes, and all you're doing by calling people out is protecting yourself, isn't that? And it just seems like, when you put it like that, all you're doing, you're just protecting yourself. You're looking after yourself. If you don't look after yourself, how can you look after anybody else? But whoever says that it's a trend, obviously has no idea what it's actually like. Like, I can't. Anybody wants to go, oh yeah, I've got a toxic parent and I've had a traumatic childhood. No one wants to hold their hands up and say that is them. No one. I would very much rather I've had a wonderful childhood, but I'm proud it happened, because I wouldn't be the woman I am today without all of it. So, grateful for all the lessons and all the shit. But Harriet, I'm so grateful for you being on. You've shared so much amazing wisdom. As with all of my guests, I ask them the same question. If you could tell yourself 10 years ago something that you know now but you wish you'd known then, what would it be? Such a mouthful.
Probably a bit simplistic to just be like, your mother's a narcissist, right? Yeah. That's probably not the kind of answer that you're looking for, probably an accurate one. I think I would have told myself to allow myself to be me, and allow myself to step into being who I truly am without trying to be what other people want me or need me to be. And that would have been something that I, at the time, would no doubt have said, but I am me. But in reality, when I look back at it, I think I was never the person that I truly wanted to be. And I was never the version of myself that I felt at peace with and that I felt happy with. I've always been a person that I feel I need to be for others. And if I could have just let myself know 10 years ago that being the me that I am most comfortable with and stepping into myself does not make me a bad daughter, doesn't make me someone who's betraying anyone, because that's something I've really struggled with, is that feeling of betrayal, and allowing myself to be myself for me without the expectation of anyone else. That would be what I would tell myself 10 years ago.
Oh, lush. That is a great answer. But also, your mum's a narcissist.
My mum's a narcissist. Please don't buy the house. Walk away.
Yeah.
That would have been the more poignant one, but I probably wouldn't have listened anyway. In fact, I can tell you I wouldn't have listened because many people had said it.
Oh, amazing. Where can people find you, Harriet?
You can find me at Toby and Rue on TikTok and on Instagram. You can find me at Harriet Shearsmith on YouTube. And then if you're interested in my community of people who are healing from traumatic childhoods, and you're interested in the podcast, you can find the podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. It is Unfollowing Mum, and it has social medias that connect to it. So it's either unfollowing_mum or just Unfollowing Mum, all one word. And lastly, you can find my book anywhere that sells books, and Amazon's probably the easiest place, and that's Mum in It.
Amazing. I'm going to stick all the links in the show notes. Thank you so much, Harriet, for being on. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to the No Rest for the Vivi podcast, written, produced and hosted by Claire Hill, and music has been composed by my brother, Phil Vitt.